Good evening. My name is Rich Janowski, and the book I read was The Texas City Disaster, 1947, written by Hugh W. Stevens. It outlines from start to finish, as well as many months after the disaster in Texas City, which involved two freightliners, two explosions within a 24-hour period, and the aftermath and the destructive nature of those explosions. As you will see throughout the book, and the detail that Stevens uses is extreme and extremely accurate. He specifically states in the beginning that his book is written based off of interviews and testimonies of witnesses and other articles. So based off the truths of those witnesses and other articles is the truths of his book. As you can see, the book is encompassing of 7 chapters that discuss the worst industrial catastrophe in the history of the United States. The first chapter is a brief description of the explosions of the Grand Camp and the High Flyer, which are the two French freightliners that were carrying the ammonium nitrate that caused the explosions. Chapter 2 takes up the chain of events leading to the first explosion, which happened on the Grand Camp. Chapter 3 leads into the effects of the blast and reactions of the survivors in Texas City and the neighboring towns who rushed to help. Chapter 4 describes the events through the afternoon of the first day, focusing on the chaos and the disorganization of the government, private sector officials once they got to the scene. Their inability to formulate a coherent response, as you will see, was a major issue. Chapter 5 describes the second day, which includes the explosion of the High Flyer and the events up through a couple weeks later. On Chapter 6, that continues to highlight the several months short-term recovery efforts and the improvement in emergency preparedness that was inspired by this disaster. And finally, in the final chapter, he discusses a brief summary of the disaster. He also discusses the ramifications of the poor response initially by all the government and the local officials. The picture you see is following the first blast of which was the Grand Camp. In this chapter, Stevens discussed how the Grand Camp explosion happened, which started off as a misplaced cigarette inside of the hold, which they were loading ammonium nitrate. After the explosion, Stevens states that in Denver, the explosion registered as an earthquake, and havoc was wreaked approximately 2,000 feet away. You'll see a couple more pictures further on in which will show the damage. Finally, he'll go into detail how the lack of situational awareness could have prevented further explosions on the High Flyer due to the fact that none of the dock workers or anybody that was in the vicinity of the pier had understood the fact that the High Flyer was also carrying ammonium nitrate, the same explosive material that was on the Grand Camp. Chapter 2, titled The Grand Camp, explains the conditions of the Grand Camp, as well as the 3 conditions that could have contributed to the disaster. First one being the apparent ignorance and indifference of officials about the hazardous potential of the fertilizer. Also the absence of governmental supervision over the dock operations, and weakness of safety management and practices. Now with this, the government, as you'll see in the book, is Stevens blames for a fair amount due to the fact that the inspections that were supposed to be conducted were not happening. The Coast Guard was dancing around the reasons why they were not inspecting. They stated that they were only to inspect if there was a violation. The Army Ordnance Bureau, who was supposed to supervise the manufacturing process, did not happen. Lock operations were not supervised. This all came down when the master or the captain of the ship told the crew to not fight the fire with water, however, to close the hatches to the holds, cover them with tarps, and turn the steam system on. This obviously was not a good idea, as it created a pressure cooker, which led to the explosions. Once the disaster struck, the explosions happened. There were hundreds of onlookers that were only a few hundred feet away, if not closer. They were obviously mortally wounded, as well as the firefighters disintegrated upon the explosion. There was chaos that was strung throughout the city. Like I said, the explosion was registered in Denver as an earthquake. There was a quick response, however, from members of the local towns that were just coming to respond to help. This is where the chaos came, when there was no organization, no unified leadership that was there to direct and guide the recovery efforts. As we saw in the previous chapter, communication and direction was a major factor. Obviously, as the time elapsed, more volunteers and medical assistants arrived. However, due to the sheer magnitude of the explosion, the lack of communication, there was shortage of equipment, supplies, and obviously the skilled personnel, which led to who needed to be triaged. It created more confusion on where to take the injured, where to take the dead, and with, obviously, as you know, rumors will begin, which will lead to disruption in the relief efforts, as some efforts may be stopped due to the fact of a rumor. And also, something I found interesting was the lack of live on-screen medium, which is, i.e. the TV. Everything was done via the radio and print due to the early evolution of the TV at this time period. Following the explosion of the Grand Camp, the two volunteers went over to the High Flyer, another ship in the area that was torn from its mooring lines off the explosion of the Grand Camp, which was found lodged next to another ship in the harbor. The two volunteers boarded the ship looking for injured and mortally wounded workers. However, they identified that there was a fire on the ship in one of the holds. They informed somebody, I'm not sure of who it was, but nothing happened. They then sent two towboats over to try to move the High Flyer from the slip. The flames grew too large, and they cut their tow lines and left. 10 minutes following their departure, the High Flyer then exploded with a larger magnitude than the Grand Camp. Once the situation was under control, that's when the coordination efforts really started to take shape. Businesses and leadership took the initiative to quickly restore vital services, rebuild key infrastructure. The explosive qualities of ammonium nitrate was then published, so transporting and housing could take more safety precautions, as well as the property damages that were caused by the explosions were quickly recovered. However, deep personal loss lingered for an extended period of time. Finally, in Chapter 7, Stevens recognizes that the Dale Height versus United States case was a wrongful death suit, was riddled with the negligent responsible officers. However, the issues were never investigated. He also continued to address the lax safety procedures on the docks, which compounded the danger and led to the chain reaction of events. Once again, as overall, he states that the communication was the crutch in the response. As you can see, here's a brief timeline of the explosions. On 16 April 1947, at approximately 8 o'clock, the hatch was removed from hold 4 to finish loading the remaining ammonium nitrate for fertilizer. Just be advised that 2,300 ton were already on board and 800 ton were already in hold 4. Approximately 15 minutes later, the workers smelled smoke and a plume was observed rising between the cargo boards. The captain of the ship ordered workers not to fight the fire with water, however, to batten down the hatches and suppress the fire and turn the steam system on. He did, however, have the small arms ammunition removed as a precautionary measure. Approximately at the time, the alarm was sounded by the Grand Camp and echoed by the Texas City Terminal Railway. The fire department was reached and a fireboat was dispatched from Galveston, Texas as well. 15 minutes later, the compressed steam coupled with the heat of the fire blew the hatch of Hold 4, throwing orange smoke columns into the air. This is when all the onlookers began to be attracted to the scene, as they stated that it was a pretty sight with the oranges in the morning sky. Approximately 15 minutes after that, 26 men and 4 fire trucks arrived, followed by the Republic Oil Refining Company's firefighting team, and they set up the hoses. There was photographic evidence that one hose was set up by 8:45. At approximately 9 o'clock, the flames erupted from the open hatch, and at 9:12, the Grand Camp disintegrated in an explosion that was heard 150 miles away. At about 9:13 a.m., the strength of the explosion ripped the High Flyer from its mooring, lodging it up against the Wilson B. Keene vessel. Many of the crew members stayed on board the High Flyer for about an hour until the master or captain was forced them to abandon ship. Much later in the afternoon, 2 men that were looking for injured or the dead boarded the High Flyer and noticed flames out of one of the holds. At about 11 o'clock, the tugs manned by volunteers from Galveston tried to pull the burning ship away from the docks. And about 1 a.m., the flames were shooting out of the hold. The tugs cut their tow lines and left the slip. 10 minutes later, the High Flyer then exploded. Witnesses stated that the explosion was larger and more powerful than the Grand Camp. The second explosion did not cause as many personal losses due to the fact that everybody was evacuated, but it only compounded the property damage. Some of the issues with the response and the cause of the disaster, there was no smoking regulations within the ships, around the holds, or near cargo. Also, the unknown shipping materials. It was stated that some of the members were unaware of the explosive materials inside of ammonium nitrate. There was lack of the supervisory roles within the federal agencies. Communications to local responders was slow, leading to the slow response of first responders, as well as a coordination amongst those responding. And also the zoning and proximity issues with relation to the slips. There were multiple refineries that were in the area, and everything was close to the slips, which caused for a much more property damage due to the explosive materials that were housed in the refineries. There were several lessons learned in the disaster. That showed that there was an inability to manage the chaos and manage an emergency. Industrial safety came to a forefront of the chemical handling companies. After the disaster and the rebuilding of the refineries, many of the companies came together to develop safer methods to store, house, and transport the materials that they had. There was a need for a continuous analysis of the chemical materials to determine the explosive behaviors. And in reading, there was something someone said about the lessons learned. It was easier to make a scene smaller than make it larger. In the event of an explosion, it is important to evacuate for the safety of the citizens. And in the city of Texas City, they had not too long before a hurricane, and they all thought that that was really the only disaster to prepare for. However, the impossible happened, and the double explosion on April 16th and 17th happened, and they were not prepared, as well as the stricter zoning regulations, which would allow for the safer distances between the refineries and the potential explosive materials.